navigate.
All right. Well, thank you, Olya, for inviting me to your class. I always appreciate invitations. This is going to be a relatively brief presentation. My name is Leonard Jason, and I am a person who has been at DePaul for a number of years. And I thought it might just be interesting to share with you just a little bit about my ancestry and some of the roots that I have in psychology. So I'm going to share my screen, and you can sort of see a little bit of a slide presentation that I have here. If I can get it all to work. All right. Thank you for your patience. So, because psychology is a young science, it's possible to trace your lineage. And there's actually some software packages that allow you to do that if you're interested. So I thought it might be interesting to see what my lineage is as well. In the field of community psychology, my mentor was Emory Cowan, who was one of the founders of the field of community psych. And I might add that when I started in a graduate student in 1971, the field was primarily male, primarily white. So most of the people that had trained me were white males. When I moved to Chicago, I also had a chance to work with Jim Kelly. So I consider him another mentor of mine. Both Emory Cowan and Jim Kelly were first generation community psychologists. So I was really in the second generation. Emory died in 2001. Jim died this last year. So Jim Kelly was the last person who was still alive from Swampscott, which occurred in 1965. So again, you can see that first generation of psychologists were the ones that actually I had the good fortune to meet and work with, and particularly Emory Cowan and Jim Kelly. Interpersonal psychology was another area that I had influence on. Harry Stack Sullivan was one of the people who was in that kind of, in a sense, neo-Freudian perspective. And Rita Underwood was trained by him. And basically, when I was a graduate student, I was trained in interpersonal psychology by Rita Underwood at Strong Hospital. Gestalt therapy, this was Fritz Perls. I had a chance to work with him also when I was an undergraduate, and he was the founder of the kind of Gestalt therapy, which some of you might have heard of, trying to integrate all different aspects of the self into one. In terms of founders of psychology, as you all know, Wundt was the person who began the field, and these are some of his people who basically he trained. The interesting experience with David Kratch, who's at the bottom of this sequence, is that David Kratch, or Krzyzewski was actually his original name, was a Berkeley psychologist who happened to be on sabbatical at Brandeis, where I went undergraduate. And my advisor, Brendan Marr, told me I should take the class with him. Brendan Marr, by the way, was a person who developed the first abnormal psychology book that was based on really empirical principles. Most of the principles were behavioral, and it was advanced psychopathology. So I took that class from Brendan Marr, and he was my advisor. And again, very influential psychologist himself. But David Kratch came to Brandeis when I was an undergraduate, as I mentioned, and he started out the class by saying his mentor was trained by Wundt. So I tried to go back to find out who his mentors were, and I got this particular sequence. It's very possible that David Kratch was maybe trained by maybe someone who was even closer to Wundt. But he said, you're only 2 or 3 generations away from the founders of psychology. And then in this seminar class, he went around and he introduced himself to each person, shook their hands and said, I am basically passing on the mantle of psychology to you. And I thought that was really cool. This guy, David Kratch, did incredible work. He was one of the founders of SPICY. These were social psychologists trying to involve themselves in social change. And as a psychologist, he was the person in the late 1950s, early 60s, who basically had enriched environments for rats. And he found that the rats' cortex actually increased by 6-7%. And before that, people never thought that the brain could actually change over time. There was that sense of things were fixed with your genes and your heredity. And basically, Kratch found that the environment does change, and what incredible implications those findings had for all the work that we currently do. And so I'm in a long line of these people. These are some other founders of psychology that you've probably heard of. From my mentor to Arthur Coombs, to Carl Rogers, to Dewey, to William James, these people all connected. One person trained another. So again, just another line of people that you can probably trace your own ancestry to if you're interested. In the field of humanistic psychology, I went to Brandeis University in part to study with Abraham Maslow. So I had that good fortune, had a chance to meet him in 1968 at Brandeis University. And Maury Schwartz from Tuesdays with Maury, some of you probably have heard his name, very famous sociologist. I had the good fortune to take a class with him when I was, again, an undergraduate at Brandeis, and Roger Weisberg was in that class, and he became a good friend of mine for the next 50 years. Carl Rogers also had an influence on another person named Chris Dowell. And Chris Dowell was a psychologist who was training people in Rogerian therapy. And I got trained in that through Chris Dowell, who was connected, was trained by Carl Rogers. The only problem with Rogerian therapy is that you get used to kind of repeating what people say. So I said, did you say, you said this? You know, so you kind of repeat back. So I started doing that too many times, and people started telling me, stop doing that, Jason, when I was an undergraduate. So sometimes you can get too fixated on a particular method. And then in behaviorism and operant conditioning, B.F. Skinner I actually had breakfast with in Chicago, had a chance to meet him. James Holland was one of his students. That's a picture of him. And he taught a course on biofeedback when I was an undergraduate. So I had a chance to directly have programmed learning. And then there was a person named Stanley Sapone, who was another behaviorist, if you can believe, even more radical than B.F. Skinner. And he had a laboratory at the University of Rochester when I went to graduate school. And I took care of his rats, and he trained me in operant conditioning so that I could learn how to work with non-speaking youth and learn those types of behavioral principles. And he was pretty much of an extremist. You couldn't use any emotions or say anything that said anything about internal states, and he would have kind of like a fit. But he certainly was a very precise scientist. And then finally, psychoanalysis. And you kind of say, well, gee, there's a strand of psychoanalysis in my training too, because Sigmund Freud trained Deutsch and Murphy. These were two psychoanalysts, and Howard Friedman was trained by Deutsch and Murphy. And Howard Friedman was my supervisor when I did an internship during graduate school at Syracuse Veterans Administration. And when I was an undergraduate, if you can believe, at McLean's Hospital in the 1960s, I actually met one of Freud's patients who was in the hospital and was very psychotic. So just kind of interesting. You can sort of see the roots of some of this that go back. So, you know, this is just kind of a fun little exercise. And I thought I would kind of show you another kind of just kind of example of this type of tree. This is kind of interesting. You've got a kind of Jean Rhodes, who is a graduate student at DePaul University in the late 1980s. And she drew up this little map. She's now a professor at University of Massachusetts. And she kind of sent me this. And Carl Rogers trained Arthur Coombs at Syracuse, who trained Emery Cowan at Rochester, who trained me. I trained Jean, and this is Jean's team. So you can kind of see these are kind of fun things to do, you know, to just sort of see your ancestry if you're interested in different movements, whether it's community psychology, and really, you know, the first and second generation of community psychology did not occur too long ago, or even psychoanalysis, or the origins of psychology, or humanistic psychology. So whatever brand of psychology you're in, you can actually sometimes have fun by just asking the person who you're working with, who trained you? And then you can actually sort of see a sequence that sometimes goes right back to the originators of the particular field that you're in. Good. Well, I wanted to just provide this very brief kind of introduction to some of the things that have had an influence on myself, and I hope this is helpful to you. And Olya kind of mentioned that I'd be able to come into your class and provide just a little bit of a background of some of the people that trained and influenced me. So I thank you for letting me come in and be part of your class for these minutes. And I hope what I have shared with you kind of shows the importance of networks and training, and this little exercise of trying to find out where we come from. Because you know something, all the types of social issues that we deal with are really embedded in history. And if we can think about ourselves in that historical process, it really helps us in terms of getting a better appreciation of how to bring about change.
We had a student move their presentation to next week, so we do have some extra time. If you have a few minutes, is that okay if we maybe keep you for a few minutes?
Sure.
Or do you have to go?
Sure.
So obviously we're really lucky that you had the time to stop by. Is there a way for you to, and I know you can't see this, so I'm gonna squeeze in here. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey into community psychology, and why was that the field that you call home?
Sure.
As opposed to maybe, you know, all the other different fields, and especially because you had such a diverse training, you settled on this particular one.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I think it's a good question for all of us to ask who are in the field or thinking about being in the field. I was really interested in politics when I was in junior high school and high school, and then college, and I tried to, and I thought maybe my career would be in policy and trying to bring about higher level change. So even when I was in eighth, ninth grade, I worked for a presidential campaign. Just, you know, licking envelopes, pretty low level stuff, but it needs to be done, making phone calls in the campaign headquarters. And I was just, you know, young teenager, and it was the Humphrey Johnson campaign of 1964. Well before, you know, any of you, probably your parents or grandparents might be around at that point. And then I was a little bit disappointed that, not a little, a lot disappointed that Johnson got us into this Vietnam War that became, I think, a major problem for our country in the 1960s. So that ended up not being, I mean, successful. My candidate won, but it didn't take much to beat kind of Goldwater in 1964, truthfully. But in any event, in 1966, because I had worked for this campaign earlier and I was in high school, I got contacted by my representative for Congress and asked if I would become charge of young citizens for Elstowski, which I did. And we had very successful campaign. And he got elected to be in the House of Representatives and in the United States. And but then Helstowski ended up in all types of political issues of scandal and stuff. And that again was a little bit disappointing. And then the third thing I had an experience with was we had a day in New Jersey where I grew up, where high school people would take over Trenton for the day and just see what it was like to have a mock Congress. And I did that with one of my best friends, a guy named Bob. And we went down to Trenton and we tried to pass laws. And actually, I drafted a law and got it passed. And but what I had to do to get the law passed was so, making deals, compromising, doing all types of stuff. By the time I finished, I did get the bill passed, and it was actually in 1967 to set up an institute so that we could study the effects of psychedelics, because we didn't know how they affected people. And the fact that we got that mock bill passed in our mock Congress, it actually went on to the regular kind of New Jersey legislature, but and it got actually a lot of publicity for what we tried to do. It didn't get passed in the real Congress, but I got also discouraged there because I just sort of saw the underside of what I was willing and able to do to get something passed, and that was a little disappointing. And then my final thing that happened was I worked for Bobby Kennedy in his presidential election, and then he got killed. And I think that was the final straw. I sort of became just a little bit disenchanted. Still was interested in social change, but I didn't know how to do it. So I thought maybe I would go into law. So one day, as an undergraduate, I took some law briefs from the Supreme Court, and I started reading them in the library, and I fell asleep. And I said, well, gee, maybe that's not my calling. But I really like psychology, and I seemed to do well in it, and it captured my attention. So I did go into psychology. But when I went into psychology, it was really just to be a traditional clinical psychologist. I didn't really think of, I didn't know of anything else you could do as a psychologist, but I had this strong background in trying to think about change from a larger level. So I completely by luck, I went to the University of Rochester because it was not that far from where, my parents and my family lived in northern New Jersey. And I went there over some other places that I might have gone to, but by chance. And I think a lot of times those things happen by luck. You don't have a lot of planning. And it turns out that was one of the hubs of community psychology. And Anne-Marie Cowan had been there since the early 1950s and had been doing community work. I had no idea, but I remember he came into our abnormal psychology class, gave a lecture, and he just changed my life with that one lecture. He basically kind of said that, the demand for services is larger than we can ever meet. The need for services is even larger. And not only that, but you as a professional, when you get your PhD, probably aren't going to be much different than paraprofessionals, because the research suggests that the two groups, paraprofessionals and professionals, have similar outcomes. So I said to myself, that's great. I've been in graduate school for 1 month, and I've already kind of realized that there's no reason for me to be here. So it was a little bit of an identity kind of challenging moment. But then he said, you as a psychologist could really be doing other things besides direct service. You could basically be thinking about prevention. You could be thinking about more public health type interventions where mental health is your objective. You could think about dissemination of interventions, using consultation, working with community groups. So those types of things captured my interest, that there could really be multiple roles that I could have. And when I heard that, I then became a one-day commitment. I was committed to becoming a clinical community psychologist. So that one lecture changed the career trajectory of my life. And I was very, very happy to be able to have that experience. So that's what kind of, it was sort of a background of wanting to be very interested in interpersonal issues, social issues, and community psychology, brought all those interests together so that I could be a psychologist, I could be rigorous, and I could also be involved in change that went beyond the individual, because it was clear to me that lots of things in our society needed to be changed, and we couldn't just focus on people who had problems as being as the solution. We really needed to think about the problems that people experience in their social environments that needed also to be changed.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions before we let Dr. Jason go?
Yeah, you mentioned that you had the privilege of studying under Abraham Maslow. I was wondering what takeaways you had from that experience.
So Olya, could you just repeat that question? I'm sorry, I didn't completely.
Yeah, in your presentation, you talked about being able to work with Abraham Maslow, and I was wondering what takeaways you had from that experience.
So, Maslow, and I wasn't able to take a class with him because he was, in 1968, he was on his way to California. So there was like a quarter that I had with him. I had a chance to have several conversations with him. And I had read his book, Toward the Psychology of Being, and I was just captivated. And basically, what Maslow said was that psychology is really dealing with deficits. It's dealing with, pathology. And there's really something else. Today, they call it the positive psychology movement. And you'll probably have heard about that. But the reality is that there are different layers of needs. And one needs to get the basic needs met through, in a sense, survival needs. But then as one works through one way up this kind of pyramid, one could ultimately get to something very high level of something like self-actualization, which would be the highest level. And that metaphor has captured the attention, I think, of many people. And I think what it sort of points us toward is that, like with everything, if you have a deficit orientation and you just try to sort of, in a sense, let's just take substance use, for example, which, because it's the most common problem, affects something like maybe 8% of the population with the substance use disorder. If you just take substances away from a person, that's what they're using for whatever reason to hopefully either avoid problems, reduce stress, or as something, a refuge from the world. But it has to be replaced. So when we talk to people in Oxford House communities, which are recovery homes for people with substance use, and some of you know that I do work with that group, if you ask them what's important, they put sort of being abstinent, maybe like 7th or 8th on the list. Things are much higher on the list that involve, they need to figure out how to get along with each other. They need to find their purpose. They have to find meaning in their life. They have to do something that they care about. If you don't work on those issues and just take something away, which is, maybe substances that they're using as a crutch, you're not solving the problem. You've got to replace it with something. And that something has to be meaningful. And if you can do that, you have a much better chance. And that's really what Maslow is about. He was basically saying, let's think about the more positive aspects of human nature and human existence. And if we understand that, we also understand that you need to have the basic motives, the basic issues in life taken care of before you can even begin to work on some of those higher levels. So again, if you think about people coming out of jail or prison, people coming out of jail or prison generally are looking for those basic needs being met. And we have about 600,000 people that are coming out of jail and prison every year. So it's a tremendous number. Many of them are there because of substance use disorders. But if you ask them, what do you need? They'll say, I need stable housing and I need a job. And those are the two things that we often don't do a good job of providing. But those are the foundations. You've got to get that done before you can actually have a chance of reducing recidivism, giving them a chance to start off their lives. So I think what Maslow was doing was really a very helpful antidote to a field that was too focused on just fixing problems.
Any other questions?
Well, again, thank you very much for this opportunity to kind of address your class. And I look forward to having a chance to have conversations with some of you that I haven't met up till now. And I wish you well.
Thank you so much.